The marble beneath your feet shudders. Cracks race across the polished floor like veins of lightning, splitting tiles that once gleamed in the torchlight of temples. A tremor surges up your legs, stealing balance, rattling the golden bracelets that mark you as more than a servant yet less than a king. Outside, a roar swells, not of voices but of the ocean itself, a sound so deep it feels alive, ancient, furious. Salt air lashes your face, sharp as a blade. The harbour groans under the weight of water dragged from its depths, ships straining against their moorings, ropes snapping with gunshot cracks. The stench of tar and smoke collides with the perfume of oil lamps spilling from toppled tables. You grip a pillar slick with condensation, marble once cold now warm from the heat of torches that sway wildly, as if the gods themselves breathe on the flames. Crowds surge into the avenues, nobles wrapped in embroidered linen shoving past fisherfolk barefoot and desperate, the line between wealth and poverty erased by terror. A priest stumbles, incense spilling from a broken censer, the sweet smoke curling above the sharper reek of burning timber. The cries of children twist with the bray of animals loosed from their pens, and through it all, a single thought carves itself into your mind like a blade into wax. The island is falling. You run, past mosaics glittering with images of Poseidon raising his trident, past fountains that once sang but now vomit muddy water, past guards who clutch their spears uselessly against a power they cannot fight. The ground heaves again, hurling you into the arms of a stranger. His robes mark him as a scholar of the royal court, yet his eyes are wide with the same raw fear as yours. For one breath you share it together, then he tears away, clutching scrolls instead of children, proof that even in ruin, men cling to their chosen treasures. The sea's roar swells into a scream. Waves blacker than night rear beyond the breakwater, lit from within by streaks of fire as lanterns smash against stone. The horizon itself rises, not a line but a wall, and for a heartbeat the world holds still. You feel the marble buckle under you, hear the temple bells crash to the ground, taste the grit of dust in your teeth. Then the ocean falls forward, and you understand too late that no palace, no fleet, no king can outlive the anger of the gods. Long before the sea claimed it, Atlantis was said to have been born from divine hands. In the dialogues of Plato, written in the 4th century before the Common Era, the story emerges not as myth told by poets, but as history remembered by priests. Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, travelled to Egypt where priests of size spoke of an island empire that flourished 9,000 years before his time. Plato, retelling this through the voices of Timaeus and Critias, placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, on the outer edge of the known world. The island was vast, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a continent adrift in the Atlantic Ocean. Its land was fertile, and its mountains rich with ore, forests, and rivers. It was not a barren outpost but a garden set upon the sea. According to Plato, the gods themselves had divided the earth among themselves, and to Poseidon fell the realm of Atlantis. The sea god found there a mortal woman named Cleito, and with her he fathered 10 sons. These sons became kings, each ruling a portion of the island, yet all swore loyalty to the firstborn, Atlas, from whom the land took its name. In this origin, Atlantis was not simply another kingdom, it was a dynasty founded by the divine, a bloodline that claimed both ocean and earth. Temples rose in honor of Poseidon, their walls plated with silver, their roofs gleaming with orichalcum, a mysterious metal described as red like fire. At the center stood an immense statue of the sea god driving 6 winged horses, his trident raised as if to remind his descendants that power flowed from his hand. Atlantis was not merely a possession of Poseidon. It was a vision of balance between god and mortal, between sea and land. The island was said to be ringed with fertile plains that yielded 2 harvests each year, nourished by rivers flowing down from snow-tipped mountains. Cattle grazed in abundance, elephants roamed its fields, and mines glittered with metals unknown to the rest of the world. Its wealth seemed inexhaustible, a gift bestowed by the gods to prove that harmony between divine order and human ambition could build paradise. But woven into Plato's telling was a warning, for if Atlantis was born of divine blessing, it also carried the weight of divine expectation. To prosper was one thing, to remain humble under prosperity was another. Atlantis began as a kingdom of order, ruled by kings bound by ancient laws inscribed on pillars of orichalcum. Yet already, in its birth, lingered the question that would haunt it forever. Could a people so blessed resist the temptation to believe themselves greater than the gods who had raised them? Atlantis stood at the edge of the known world, a beacon of divine favor. Yet on every horizon waited the possibility that what is given can also be taken away. At the heart of Atlantis stood a city unlike any other. Plato described it as a marvel of design, a capital shaped by both divine imagination and human craft. Its form was concentric, a series of alternating rings of land and water carved into the earth by Poseidon himself. 3 rings of sea and 2 of land encircled the royal island at the center, each connected by bridges and guarded by gates of bronze. From above, it would have appeared as a vast ripple upon the ocean, a city grown outward like the circles cast by a stone dropped in water. The outermost canal stretched so wide that ships with oars and sails could pass with ease. Docks bristled with masts, their ropes creaking as crews unloaded treasures from distant lands. Beyond the harbors rose walls plated in metals that caught the sun with blinding force. Some gleamed with brass, others with tin, while the inner wall shone with orichalcum, the mysterious red alloy said to exist only in Atlantis. To the eyes of foreign sailors who glimpsed it, the city must have looked aflame, glowing as though the gods themselves had hammered its towers. Within the innermost ring stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon. The palace, built of alternating blocks of black, red, and white stone, gleamed with ornamented roofs and golden statues. The temple rose even higher, its columns towering, its ceiling inlaid with ivory and precious metals. At its center, in a chamber open to the sky, stood a colossal statue of Poseidon. He drove 6 winged horses, his figure cast in gold so massive that it towered above priests and kings alike. Around him gathered statues of his divine children, the first rulers of Atlantis, reminding each new generation of their origin and their duty. Yet the city was more than its monuments. Markets spilled across the avenues, filled with the clamor of traders, the scent of spices carried from far coasts, and the glimmer of textiles woven with dyes unknown to mainland Greeks. Aqueducts carried fresh water from the mountains, fountains gushed in the courtyards of nobles, and the hum of voices in dozens of languages echoed through its streets. The City of Rings was not only a palace for kings but a magnet for the world, a place where sailors, merchants, and scholars arrived, dazzled, and stayed. But the very perfection of Atlantis carried with it a shadow. A city so ordered, so adorned, so powerful could not help but believe it stood apart from all others. To live within those rings was to believe oneself invulnerable, shielded not only by walls and waters but by the favor of the gods. The concentric circles that seemed to protect Atlantis also enclosed it, turning paradise into a gilded fortress. For now, the city gleamed like a beacon of harmony between man and God. Yet already its walls contained the seed of pride, a pride that would one day split stone as surely as the sea. Atlantis was not only magnificent in design, it was abundant in every measure of wealth. The island itself was a treasure chest, and its people lived as though the earth and sea had conspired to give them all things in excess. Its plains stretched wide, fertile as few lands in the world, producing grain twice in the cycle of a single year. Rains fell steadily in winter, and in summer, mountain springs fed rivers that spread across the lowlands, leaving no corner barren. Orchards bore fruit so heavily that branches sagged to the ground, and fields of reeds grew thick along the watercourses, providing materials for craft as well as food for animals. The richness of its soil was matched by the bounty of its creatures. Herds of cattle and sheep roamed in number beyond counting, while wild horses thundered across the plains, prized by nobles for chariots and war. Elephants, rare in most lands, were said to wander Atlantis in great numbers, their ivory gleaming in markets and temples. Birds filled the skies, fish crowded the harbors, and the island seemed to contain every variety of life known to the ancient world. Yet even these gifts paled beside the metals of Atlantis. Deep beneath the mountains lay veins of copper, tin, and gold, extracted by miners whose labor fed the city's splendor. Among these riches was orichalcum, a substance described by Plato as second only to gold in value, glowing red as if lit by fire. Atlantean artisans polished it into plates for the walls of temples and cast it into ornaments that caught the torchlight like embers. The very sight of it set Atlantis apart from all rivals, for no other land was said to possess it in such abundance. Ships laden with goods sailed outward from the harbors, their hulls filled with wine, oil, metals, and textiles dyed in rare colors. In return, they brought spices, perfumes, and exotic animals from distant coasts. Atlantis, self-sufficient as it was, still traded widely, its wealth growing until kings counted their power not by their armies, but by the tribute of nations. To foreign eyes, the island was more than a kingdom. It was a garden fortified by stone, a place where prosperity flowed without end. But in prosperity, danger hides. The kings of Atlantis, bound by laws inscribed in orichalcum pillars, once ruled with restraint. They feasted together only after swearing oaths to Poseidon, pledging to govern justly and to resist greed. Over time, however, the endless gifts of nature dulled those vows. When a people live in a land where fields never fail, mines never empty, and herds never diminish, humility becomes harder to hold. Atlantis, swollen with treasure, began to mistake wealth for invulnerability. The more its vaults filled, the more its people forgot that riches can also be chains, drawing envy from abroad and pride from within. What had once been the strength of the kingdom began to turn into the seed of its decline. Wealth alone does not destroy a nation. It is what wealth does to the hearts of its people that begins the unraveling. In the early days of Atlantis, kings still gathered at the temple of Poseidon, swearing solemn oaths before feasting. They pledged to uphold laws inscribed on pillars of orichalcum, to govern with justice, and to temper ambition with humility. For generations, those vows held. The Atlanteans were fierce sailors, clever engineers, and proud of their divine descent, yet they lived with balance. But prosperity, stretched across centuries, corrodes restraint. As Atlantis grew richer, its kings grew restless. The great fleets that once protected the island began to patrol farther, no longer content to guard but to conquer. Armies that had been symbols of unity became instruments of ambition. Atlantean generals spoke of bringing the Mediterranean under their command, of bending foreign ports and kingdoms into tributary states. What had begun as protection of empire turned into the hunger for domination. The people themselves mirrored their rulers. Merchants who once measured success by trade began to boast of wealth beyond necessity. Craftsmen who once labored for devotion to the gods now forged ornaments designed only to impress foreign guests. Even the temples, once symbols of divine gratitude, grew extravagant, their offerings less about worship and more about display. Priests spoke of Poseidon's favor, yet fewer remembered that favor could also be withdrawn. Aristocrats flaunted chariots, plated with metals, soldiers drilled with increasing arrogance, and common citizens, swept into the rhythm of expansion, began to view themselves as chosen above all other peoples. To be Atlantean was no longer simply to be blessed, it was to be superior. Travelers from abroad wrote of the awe and fear Atlantis inspired, a land so rich and organized that it seemed invincible. For the Atlanteans, such awe became intoxicating, convincing them that no rival could stand against their armies or fleets. But beneath the pride lingered unease. Laws that once bound the kings were broken in whispers. Bribes began to sway judgments. rival heirs quarreled, seeking to expand their share of dominion. Families who traced their blood to Poseidon himself used that divine claim not as a reminder of duty, but as a weapon of prestige. The unity of Atlantis, once its greatest strength, began to show cracks. Plato described it with blunt clarity. The Atlanteans, who had once been virtuous, lost their virtue, and the divine portion in them grew faint. What remained was hunger, arrogance, and desire for power unmoored from restraint. It was in this climate that the kings of Atlantis cast their gaze across the sea, no longer content with their garden of abundance, convinced instead that the world itself should bend to their will. Pride had carried them far, yet pride is also the weight that drags empires down. As Atlantis grew in power, its gaze turned toward the heart of the Mediterranean. Fleet after fleet sailed beyond the Pillars of Heracles, pressing into lands that had once looked upon the island only with awe. Kingdoms yielded tribute, cities bent their knees, and soon the Atlantean Empire stretched across coasts and islands from the distant west to the shores of Italy and Egypt. To its rulers, this was the natural order, a confirmation that their divine heritage entitled them to dominion. But conquest has its limits, and it was in Greece that Atlantis met its first true resistance. Athens, though smaller in land and poorer in treasure, stood firm. In Plato's telling, this was not the Athens of his own day, but of an age of heroes, a city guided by virtue rather than greed, by discipline rather than indulgence. Where Atlantis wielded overwhelming wealth, Athens relied on courage. Where Atlantis bent laws to ambition, Athens upheld them even in hardship. The confrontation became more than a clash of armies. It became a test of values. Atlantean fleets filled the horizon, their sails flashing red and gold, their oars rising and falling in relentless rhythm. Thousands of soldiers, armed with spears tipped in bronze and shields inlaid with orichalcum, marched onto foreign shores. They expected swift victory, for who could resist an empire so vast? Yet in Athens, citizens rallied not out of fear but out of duty. Farmers left their fields, philosophers their schools, artisans their workshops, all united in defense of the city's freedom. The battles were fierce. Waves crashed with the weight of triremes colliding, their hulls splintering as men fought hand to hand on shifting decks. On land, the dust of marching armies darkened the sky, and the clash of bronze echoed across valleys. Yet time after time, the Atlanteans were checked. A city that prized courage over riches, that measured wealth not in gold but in loyalty to its people, stood against the might of an empire and did not break. Plato's story holds Athens as the victor, the city that repelled the Atlantean tide. To his listeners, it was a parable of virtue triumphing over arrogance, of restraint proving stronger than indulgence. Athens became the mirror in which Atlantis saw its own corruption reflected. For the Atlanteans, defeat was not only military, it was spiritual. Their armies, vast and disciplined, had failed before a city that drew strength not from treasure but from unity. In this moment, the fate of Atlantis was sealed. For if a mortal city could resist them, what would the gods themselves decide? The empire had stretched beyond its rightful bounds. The balance that had once marked Atlantis as a paradise had tilted into hubris. What followed would not be measured in victories or losses of men, it would be measured in the judgment of the divine. When Athens stood firm against Atlantis, the balance of the world was shaken. The Atlanteans had grown strong beyond measure, yet in their triumph, they had also grown corrupt. Their laws, once sacred, were bent. Their temples, once houses of devotion, became halls of display. Their kings, descended from Poseidon, no longer spoke with reverence but with arrogance. Even in victory, they had lost themselves. Defeat only exposed what was already broken. The gods, who had once divided the earth among themselves, watched with growing displeasure. Zeus, ruler of Olympus, gathered them together in council. In Plato's Critias, the dialogue breaks off at this very moment, leaving only the promise of what the judgment would be. Yet the meaning is clear. To the Greeks, a people who forget piety and moderation, who turn from balance into greed, invite the wrath of heaven. Picture the divine assembly. Clouds rolling across the sky, thunder splitting the air, lightning crawling like veins of fire across the horizon. The gods seated upon high thrones, each presiding over their portion of the world, turning their gaze toward Atlantis. Poseidon, father of the Atlantean kings, silent in shame as Zeus speaks. No mortal voice records his words, yet the silence of Plato's broken dialogue rings louder than any decree. Atlantis, the utopia of the sea, had fallen from grace, and its punishment would not be delayed. The judgment was not one of men, but of balance. A kingdom that had taken too much would be stripped of all. A people who believed themselves invincible would learn that the ocean itself, their source of power, could also be their executioner. The gods did not send armies or plagues. They sent the earth and the sea, the two forces no mortal army can resist. In myth, this decision was not simply a punishment. It was a cleansing. Just as Zeus had once sent the great flood to wash away an earlier age of men, so now the waters would rise again, but this time to erase a city that had mocked the limits set by the divine. Atlantis, which had risen as the proof of harmony between gods and mortals, would sink as proof of what happens when harmony turns to hubris. The Atlanteans, for all their walls and riches, could not hear the warning in time. While kings plotted new conquests and merchants counted gold, the sea began to stir beneath their very feet. The night began with trembling. At first it was subtle, a quiver in the earth that rattled clay jars in kitchens and sent ripples across fountains in the courtyards. Atlanteans paused, unsettled, but accustomed to the island's restless soil. Few imagined that this would be the last night their city would ever see. The tremors grew into convulsions. Marble columns, once proud and unshakable, cracked with thunderous echoes. Roof tiles slid loose and shattered against stone pavements. Statues of gods swayed in their pedestals, eyes of gold catching firelight before plunging into rubble. The ground itself opened in jagged scars, swallowing gardens, temples and streets, as though the island were being torn apart from within. Then came the sea. From the harbours, sailors shouted in panic as the tide drew back unnaturally, dragging ships into the muck. Anchors snapped, keels groaned, and seabeds lay exposed, glittering with stranded fish. An eerie silence followed, the hush before the ocean struck. On the horizon rose a wall of black water, higher than the tallest watchtower, foaming with white fire where lightning struck its crest. For a single breath, the entire city stared in frozen awe. Then the wave fell. The first impact shattered the docks, splintering fleets of triremes and barges as though they were toys of driftwood. The waters surged into the lower rings of the city, tearing bridges from their foundations, flinging market stalls into the flood. People clung to pillars and rooftops, screaming as the current ripped them away. Horses thrashed in stables before vanishing under torrents of foam. Fires sparked from overturned lamps, only to be drowned in seconds by the next wave. The earthquakes did not relent. As the sea advanced, the earth convulsed again, dragging entire districts into the chasms that opened beneath them. Temples collapsed, their columns buckling like reeds. The great statue of Poseidon in his temple, once the proud symbol of divine favour, toppled headlong into the flood, its golden trident vanishing in a swirl of foam and ash. Some tried to flee to the mountains, but even the highlands betrayed them. Hills crumbled, forests fell, and torrents of mud swept whole villages away. The island itself seemed to tilt, groaning, as if it were a ship taking on water. And then, with a roar that drowned every human cry, Atlantis broke. In one day and one night, as Plato had written, the sea consumed the island. Where once there had been walls plated in shining orichalcum, there was only the churn of waves. Where once there had been markets filled with voices, there was silence. The concentric rings of the city dissolved into rippling circles across a dark ocean, as if the sea itself mocked the design it had erased. When dawn rose, nothing remained but the restless tide. When the waters closed over Atlantis, the island slipped into silence. No ruins were left above the waves, no survivors to tell their story, at least none that history preserved. Yet the memory endured, carried not by monuments but by words. It was in the writings of Plato, in the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, that Atlantis found its place in the imagination of the world. Plato presented the tale as one told to Solon, who had heard it from priests of Egypt. They claimed the events had taken place 9,000 years before Solon's lifetime, a span that would push Atlantis back into the deep past, long before the Greece known to history. To Plato's audience in the 4th century before the Common Era, this lent the story an air of authority. Egypt, with its vast records and antiquity, was seen as the keeper of knowledge older than Greece itself. Yet scholars, then as now, wrestled with the question, was Atlantis a history, or was it an allegory? Plato was not a historian. He was a philosopher, weaving myths into arguments about virtue, justice, and the ideal state. To some, Atlantis was a warning dressed as a story, a parable of how wealth and pride corrupt, how even the greatest societies fall when they forget moderation. In this reading, Atlantis was never meant to be found on a map. It was meant to be found in reflection. Still, others searched for echoes in the real world. Some pointed to the island of Thera, now called Santorini, where a catastrophic eruption in the 17th century before the Common Era destroyed a thriving Minoan city. Its houses, frescoes, and harbours bore uncanny similarities to Plato's description of a wealthy, seafaring people undone by disaster. Others argued that memories of floods and earthquakes, common in the Mediterranean, had merged into a single legend, magnified and reshaped across generations. The debate did not end in antiquity. Through the ages, writers, explorers, and scholars revived the question: was Plato preserving a fragment of real history? Or was he crafting a myth that reflected the dangers he saw in his own Athens, a city already swollen with empire and ambition? The absence of definitive proof left space for speculation, and in that space, Atlantis thrived. What is certain is that Atlantis never left the human imagination. Whether allegory or memory, whether invention or echo of real disaster, the story carried weight. It was the image of a utopia undone by pride, a paradise drowned in a single night, a civilization erased not by foreign conquest, but by its own excess. And in that haunting silence, Atlantis became larger than any single truth. Though Atlantis vanished beneath the waves, its shadow stretched across time. In the centuries after Plato, philosophers and historians debated its meaning, while poets and storytellers transformed it into symbol. To the Romans, the tale was a curiosity, a reminder of the limits of empire, even as their own power expanded. In the medieval world, when Europe's memory of classical texts grew dim, the story flickered only faintly, carried in manuscripts preserved by scholars in monasteries and in the libraries of the Islamic world. But when the Renaissance dawned, Atlantis rose again. As explorers set their sails westward into seas beyond the Pillars of Heracles, they searched not only for new lands but for old ones. Some believed the great island lay somewhere across the Atlantic, its ruins waiting to be rediscovered. Maps were drawn with vast islands in uncharted waters, their coastlines sketched from imagination more than knowledge, and often labelled with names that echoed Plato's vision. Atlantis became less a lost past than a promised discovery, a prize that might still be waiting. In the centuries that followed, the myth only deepened. Francis Bacon, in the 17th century, used the idea of a lost island of wisdom in his work New Atlantis, reshaping it as a model for an enlightened society of science and reason. Later, thinkers connected the tale to half-forgotten memories of ancient catastrophes, to biblical floods, to vanished civilizations rumoured across the globe. With each retelling, Atlantis changed shape, no longer bound only to Plato's words but adapted to the desires of those who dreamed of it. By the modern age, Atlantis became a canvas for speculation. Some claimed it was hidden beneath the waves of the Mediterranean, others placed it in the Caribbean, or even beneath the ice of Antarctica. Expeditions set out with hope of finding ruins, while popular writers spun tales of technologies far ahead of their time, of crystals, machines, and wisdom lost to the sea. Scholars often dismissed these as fantasy, yet even in dismissal the fascination remained. Atlantis endures not because it can be proven, but because it cannot. It is a story of utopia and ruin, of power and punishment, of ambition unmoored from restraint. It is the tale of every civilization that has believed itself eternal, only to find the ground trembling beneath its feet. Whether it was a memory of the Minoans, a parable of Athens, or a pure invention of Plato's pen, Atlantis remains alive in the imagination because it captures a truth deeper than history. The waves may have erased its walls, but they could not erase the idea. Atlantis survives wherever people look at their own cities, their own empires, and wonder if the sea is waiting for them too. Step back now from the broken harbors, from the waves that swallowed palaces, from the trembling ground that pulled a kingdom into the sea. What remains of Atlantis is not marble, not metal, not the red glow of orichalcum. What remains is the question. Was it memory or invention? Was it the echo of real disaster or the mirror of human ambition? Plato left no certainty, and perhaps that is why the story lives on. Atlantis is less a place than a parable. It speaks of how abundance can turn to arrogance, how power can swell until it blinds those who wield it, how even a people blessed by gods can lose their way. The Atlanteans built walls, fleets, and temples, but they could not build humility. When Athens stood against them, it was not just a battle of armies. It was a warning that virtue outlasts success, that courage outlives pride. For every age that followed, Atlantis has carried a different face. To philosophers, it was allegory. To explorers, it was a prize waiting across uncharted waters. To modern seekers, it is a mystery that might still rest beneath the waves. But beneath all of these visions lies the same truth. No civilization is eternal. No empire is beyond collapse. The sea does not remember glory. It remembers silence. And yet, there is resilience in the legend. The very fact that we still speak of Atlantis, more than 2 millennia after Plato first set the words to papyrus, means that it was never entirely lost. It lingers as symbol, as warning, as dream. To imagine Atlantis is to imagine both paradise and ruin, both the heights of human possibility and the depths of human folly. Perhaps that is why the story refuses to fade. Atlantis does not tell us only about a city that drowned. It tells us about ourselves, about the fragility of what we build, about the choices that can tip us from harmony into hubris. In the end, Atlantis endures not because it was real, but because it is true.